Welcome to BeFM Drama, where we turn great literature into gripping radio. I'm your host, Joshua Cornwell, and tonight we're bringing you the final part in our adaptation of The Harpooned Man, a classic Sherlock Holmes story from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Sherlock Holmes has been assisting Inspector Hopkins' investigation of the murder of Peter Carey, a former sea captain with an evil temper who was impaled on a whaler's harpoon. Hopkins has pinned the murder on a young man named John Hopley Neligan, the son of a disgraced banker who disappeared in his yacht with a valuable collection of financial securities that have since reappeared on the market, with Peter Carey as their first seller. John Neligan claims to have been investigating what became of his father, and Holmes is unconvinced by Hopkins' solution of the case. He has proposed a solution of his own, and has invited the young inspector to his home, where he's prepared a trap for his suspect. I sat with my revolver in my pocket, waiting to see the results of the plan that Holmes had set in motion. We heard some gruff voices talking in the hall, and then Mrs. Hudson opened the door to say that there were 3 men outside asking for a Captain Basil. Holmes smiled brightly.
"I'm Captain Basil. Show them in, please, one by one."
The first who entered was a little man, with ruddy cheeks and fluffy white side whiskers. Holmes had drawn a letter from his pocket.
"What's your name?"
James Lancaster.
"Oh, I'm sorry, Lancaster, but the ship is full. Here is half a sovereign for your trouble."
The second man was a long, dried-up creature named Hugh Pattons. He was also dismissed. The third applicant was a powerfully built man of startling appearance. His fierce bulldog face was framed by a tangle of hair and beard, and his dark eyes gleamed from beneath bushy white eyebrows. He saluted and stood proudly, sailor fashion.
"Your name?"
Patrick Cairns.
"Harpooner?"
Yes, sir. 26 voyages.
"Dundee, I suppose."
Yes, sir.
"And ready to start off with the ship?"
Yes, sir.
"At what wages?"
£8 a month.
"Can you start at once?"
As soon as I get my gear.
"Do you have your papers?"
Yes, sir.
"You are the man I want. The agreement is on the side table. Go ahead and sign it."
The seaman lurched across the room and took up the pen.
Shall I sign here?
Holmes leaned over his shoulder and began to slip both hands behind his neck.
"That will do."
I heard a click of steel and a bellow like an enraged bull. A moment later, the 2 men were rolling on the floor. Cairns was a man of such gigantic strength that Holmes would have been overpowered even with the handcuffs on his wrists if Hopkins and I hadn't joined in. It was only when I placed my revolver barrel between his eyes that Cairns surrendered. We tied his ankles with cable and stood panting.
"I apologize, Hopkins, but I hope you'll enjoy your breakfast all the more, knowing you've brought this case to a triumphant conclusion."
Inspector Hopkins was speechless with amazement.
I don't know what to say, Mr. Holmes. It seems I've been making a fool of myself from the start. I understand now what I should never have forgotten, that I am a student and you are the master.
Well, we all learn by experience, and your lesson is to never lose sight of the alternative. You were so focused on young Neligan that you couldn't spare a thought for Patrick Cairns, the true murderer of Peter Carey.
The hoarse voice of the captured seaman interrupted our conversation.
See here, mister. I make no complaint of being manhandled in this fashion, but I won't have you call things by their wrong names. You say I murdered Peter Carey, I say I killed him, and there's the difference. Maybe you won't believe what I have to say about him.
Not at all. Let us hear it.
It's quickly told, and every word of it is true. I knew Black Peter, and when he pulled out his knife, I put that harpoon right through him, because I knew it was him or me. You can call it murder, I don't. Anyhow, I'd as gladly die with a rope around my neck as with Black Peter's knife in my heart.
How did you come to be in that cabin?
I'll tell you from the beginning. Just sit me up a little so I can speak easy.
Cairns's tale took us back 7 years to August 1883. In that year, Peter Carey was the captain of the whaler Sea Unicorn, and Cairns was his master harpooner. They were coming out of the ice pack on their way south when they picked up a small yacht that had been blown north and capsized. there was only one man on her. His crew had abandoned him in a lifeboat and made for the Norwegian coast, and had likely drowned. Carey ordered the man taken on board, and had long talks with the castaway in his cabin. The only thing the rescued man carried with him was one tin box. So far as Cairns knew, the man's name was never mentioned, but it was clearly Neligan Sr., the disgraced banker. On the second night, Neligan disappeared from the ship as if he'd never been. It was said that he had either thrown himself overboard or fallen in the bad weather. Only one man knew what had happened to him, and that was Patrick Cairns, who had seen with his own eyes as Peter Carey tripped the helpless banker over the railing and into the black water in the dead of night, 2 days before they landed in Scotland. Cairns kept his knowledge of the murder to himself and waited to see what would happen. When the Sea Unicorn reached port, the incident was quickly hushed up, and nobody asked any questions. A stranger had died by accident, and it was nobody's business to investigate. Shortly afterwards, Peter Carey gave up the sea, and it was many years before Cairns found out where he was. He'd guessed that Carey had done the murder for the sake of whatever was in the banker's tin box, and that Carey could now afford to pay Cairns well for the privilege of keeping his mouth shut. Cairns discovered where Carey was living through a sailor friend who he met in London, and went down to Sussex to blackmail him. Their first conversation, on Monday night, was reasonable enough, and Carey seemed ready to give Cairns what he needed to free him from the sea for life. They were to fix it all 2 nights later, but when Cairns arrived he found Peter Carey drunk and furious. They sat and drank and talked about old times, but the more Carey drank, the more angry he looked. Cairns spotted the harpoon on the wall and thought he might need it before the night was through. Cairns stared at us defiantly as he reached the climax of his tale.
When Black Peter came at me, spitting and cursing, with murder in his eyes and the great knife in his hand, I was well ready. He had no time to get it from his sheath before I had the harpoon through him. What a yell he gave! And his face still gets between me and my sleep. I stood there, with his blood splashing around me like rain, waited for an alarm, but all was quiet. I looked around and saw the tin box on the shelf. I took it with me and left the hut. Like a fool, I forgot my tobacco pouch on the table. Now, I'll tell you the queerest part. I had hardly got outside the hut when I heard something coming, and hid in the bush. A little pale fella came slinking along into the hut, gave a shriek as if he'd seen a ghost, and ran off as fast as he could. Who he was or what he wanted is more than I could tell. For my part, I walked 10 miles, got the train, and came back to London.
And the tin box?
No money in it. Nothing but papers I wouldn't dare sell. I'd lost my hold on Black Peter, and I was stranded in London without a penny. I had only my trade. I saw your advertisements for harpooners, went back to the shipping agents, and they sent me here. That's what I know. And I say again that if I killed Black Peter, the law should thank me, because I saved them the cost of a noose.
A very clear statement. I think, Hopkins, that you should waste no time in bringing this prisoner to a cell. Mr. Patrick Cairns is occupying too large a portion of my carpet.
Mr. Holmes, I do not know how to express my thanks. Even now, I do not understand how you attained this result.
By getting the right clue from the beginning. It is possible if I'd known about the notebook and securities I might have gone down the wrong path as you did, but everything I knew pointed in the one direction. The killer's amazing strength, his skill with the harpoon, the rum and water on the table, the sealskin tobacco pouch and coarse tobacco, all this evidence pointed to a sailor, specifically a whaler. I was convinced that the initials P.C. upon the pouch was simply a coincidence, and not those of Peter Carey, since he never smoked and no pipe was found in his cabin. You remember when I asked if whiskey and brandy were in the cabin. You said that they were. How many landsmen are there who would drink rum when they could have other spirits? I was certain it was a seaman.
And how did you find him?
My dear sir, the problem had become very simple. If it were a seaman, it could only be a man who had been with him on the Sea Unicorn. As far as I could learn, Carey had sailed on no other ship. I spent 3 days telegraphing Dundee, and learned the names of the crew of the Sea Unicorn in 1883. When I found Patrick Cairns in the list of harpooners, I had my suspect in sight. I figured that the man was probably in London and would desire to leave the country for a time after the murder. So I spent some time in the role of Captain Basil, planned an Arctic expedition, put forth tempting advertisements for experienced harpooners, and you see the result.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Elementary. But, Hopkins, you must release young Neligan as soon as possible. I think you owe him some apology. The tin box must also be returned to him, of course, along with his father's securities, though, of course, the securities Peter Carey sold are lost forever. He must content himself with what's left, and with the truth of his father's death. Oh, there's the cab. Hopkins, you can remove your prisoner. If you want me for the trial, my address and that of Watson will be somewhere in Norway. I'll send the particulars later.
Hopkins looked at Holmes blankly.
What I mean, my good sir, is that I'll have nothing to do with it. Farewell, Inspector.
And with that, Holmes washes his hands of the case of the Harpooned Man, and we come to the end of Part 5 in our adaptation of this story here on BeFM Drama. If you've enjoyed this program, I encourage you to check out our special compilation broadcast on Sunday evening. From our studios in Busan, this is your host, Joshua Cornwell.